Under the blinding glare of cameras, Ron DeSantis stood at the podium, shoulders squared, tone measured, the room bracing for another partisan strike. Reporters' pens hovered midair, waiting for the familiar fire. But instead, a flicker crossed his face, hesitation, almost human. He looked up, scanning the crowd, then turned toward a seat near the front. Jasmine Crockett sat there, calm and unguarded, her hands folded as if she already knew something was shifting. The air thickened. DeSantis gripped the lectern, exhaled slowly, and spoke, not like a governor defending a record, but like a man laying one down. "Before we begin," he said, voice lower than anyone had ever heard it, "I need to acknowledge someone whose service has reminded us what leadership really means." A hush swept through the room. Even the clicking shutters stopped. Jasmine's eyes lifted, steady, curious. DeSantis continued, each word deliberate, almost reluctant, as though breaking through years of armor. "Congresswoman Crockett's humanitarian work has," he paused, swallowed, "restored faith where division once lived." The silence that followed wasn't political. It was human. And then, for the first time, the room went still. But what he said next didn't just surprise his critics. It changed how millions saw him overnight. For years, American politics had turned applause into ammunition. Every handshake was a headline, every compliment a scandal waiting to happen. Unity had become almost unthinkable, a word reserved for speeches, not for moments like this. And if there was anyone least expected to break that pattern, it was Ron DeSantis. He had built his name on defiance, on the strength of his convictions, on refusing to yield an inch to the other side. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, had become his foil in the public imagination, the calm voice challenging his policies, the steady presence that refused to match his fire with fire. Where he drew lines, she crossed them to deliver aid. Where he waged culture wars, she showed up with blankets, food, and volunteers. Their paths had collided before, on debate stages, in sound bites, through pointed tweets and heated committee exchanges. To his supporters, she was the ideal opponent, articulate, relentless, unafraid. To hers, he was the perfect symbol of the arrogance she vowed to dismantle. They were never meant to share the same sentence, let alone the same moment of grace. And yet, here they were. In an era when mercy was mocked as weakness, DeSantis' voice cracked the script America had grown tired of watching. His acknowledgement didn't just cross a line, it erased one. For a heartbeat, ideology took a back seat to empathy. Cameras captured all. The governor known for political combat, now speaking the language of humility, and the congresswoman long dismissed as too idealistic, simply listening without the need to win. It wasn't just politics. It was a mirror held up to a country desperate for decency. In living rooms across America, viewers leaned closer, unsure whether to believe what they were seeing. Was this strategy or sincerity? Redemption or rehearsal? The uncertainty only made it more electric. Because in a world where every gesture is filtered through suspicion, one act of respect can feel revolutionary. Which is why, when DeSantis stepped up to that podium, no one could have predicted what came next. Ron DeSantis had spent years becoming a symbol of certainty in uncertain times. Cameras loved him because he never flinched. He could take a room full of dissenters and turn their questions into ammunition. His press conferences were performances, sharp, rehearsed, defiant. His words sliced through reporters' sentences before they finished, and his tone left no room for gray. To his supporters, that was strength. To his critics, it was something colder, control without compassion. He had been called many things: warrior, opportunist, patriot, provocateur. In the divided theater of modern politics, he played his part flawlessly. Every headline, every confrontation, every viral clip built the myth of a man who didn't blink, didn't bend, didn't back down. He wore that image like armor, and it worked. It kept him safe. It kept him winning. But armor is heavy, and even the strongest men grow tired of carrying it. Behind closed doors, those who knew him spoke of a quieter side. The father who slipped into Little League stands unnoticed, the husband who read bedtime stories between meetings, a veteran who had seen the real cost of silence and sacrifice. There were moments, brief, fleeting, when the man beneath the rhetoric surfaced, asking questions no soundbite could answer. They said it began after a visit to a children's hospital in Orlando, where he met a young girl recovering from a hurricane-induced injury. She had no idea who he was. She just asked him why people on TV always looked so angry when they talked about helping others. Her question lingered long after the cameras left. Still, politics rewards armor, not introspection. The next morning, he was back on stage, confident, unyielding, every trace of doubt buried beneath applause. But something in him shifted quietly. That seed of dissonance grew each time he saw tragedy replayed as entertainment. Each time anger became the loudest form of patriotism. His critics never saw that side. They saw the governor who banned books, battled teachers' unions, clashed with corporate giants. They saw headlines and hashtags, not the human being balancing conviction with conscience. The image he'd built of toughness, of dominance, wasn't false, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Even allies noticed the cracks. A longtime staffer once whispered, "He doesn't like what the noise is doing to people." But in politics, sincerity is risk. To care openly is to invite attack. And so, he buried that hesitation beneath another layer of certainty. Until Jasmine Crockett's story found him. When news broke of her humanitarian mission, how she crossed state lines after a flood to rebuild homes for families she'd never met, something in her actions reached him differently. It wasn't politics, it was purpose. She didn't grandstand. She didn't post. She just showed up again and again, with the kind of compassion no law could legislate. It was everything he'd once believed public service should be before it became a battlefield. People wondered why DeSantis' tribute that night felt so genuine. The truth is, it wasn't born in that moment. It had been simmering long before, waiting for release. Because somewhere between the soldier he once was and the symbol he became, he remembered what it felt like to simply admire someone doing good without calculation. And in a world where admiration feels dangerous, that realization can be revolutionary. He stood on that stage not as the governor defending his legacy, but as a man reclaiming it. And maybe, just maybe, that door began to open when he learned what Jasmine Crockett had done. His critics never saw that side. They saw the governor who banned books, battled teachers' unions, clashed with corporate giants. They saw headlines and hashtags, not the human being balancing conviction with conscience. The image he'd built of toughness, of dominance, wasn't false, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Even allies noticed the cracks. A longtime staffer once whispered, "He doesn't like what the noise is doing to people." But in politics, sincerity is risk. To care openly is to invite attack. And so, he buried that hesitation beneath another layer of certainty. Until Jasmine Crockett's story found him. When news broke of her humanitarian mission, how she crossed state lines after a flood to rebuild homes for families she'd never met, something in her actions reached him differently. It wasn't politics, it was purpose. She didn't grandstand. She didn't post. She just showed up again and again, with the kind of compassion no law could legislate. It was everything he'd once believed public service should be before it became a battlefield. People wondered why DeSantis' tribute that night felt so genuine. The truth is, it wasn't born in that moment. It had been simmering long before, waiting for release. Because somewhere between the soldier he once was and the symbol he became, he remembered what it felt like to simply admire someone doing good without calculation. And in a world where admiration feels dangerous, that realization can be revolutionary. He stood on that stage not as the governor defending his legacy, but as a man reclaiming it. And maybe, just maybe, that door began to open when he learned what Jasmine Crockett had done. Long before cameras followed her, Jasmine Crockett was already doing the work no one saw. She wasn't born into the comfort of power. She built her influence one conversation, one courtroom, one community at a time. The daughter of teachers, She learned early that dignity wasn't given, it was defended. Her life became a blueprint of persistence, a quiet rebellion against the idea that empathy was weakness. When hurricanes tore through Texas, she didn't wait for headlines to make it urgent. She packed her own car with bottled water and supplies, driving into neighborhoods where roads were half drowned and electricity was a rumor. The cameras arrived days later, but by then she'd already slept 3 nights on a cot beside strangers who would never forget her name. She didn't come with speeches, she came with shovels. And when people thanked her, she just smiled and said, "This is what service is supposed to look like." Her hands bore the marks of the work, mud-streaked, raw from hauling debris, steady as she passed out meals. When storms hit again, she was there again. Floods, fires, schools without roofs. Her calendar filled with disasters, her spirit never did. As a lawyer, she'd stood between evictions and the families they threatened. In Congress, she spoke with the same voice she used in those shelters. Calm, factual, but carrying the weight of lived truth. Where others shouted to be heard, Jasmine learned the power of listening. Her presence alone disarmed anger. Her composure humiliated cruelty without a single insult. But her humanitarian reach extended beyond politics. She created programs for underfunded schools, where she read to children about leaders who looked like them and dreamed like them. In those classrooms, her name wasn't Representative Crockett. It was just Miss Jasmine. The media liked to call her unshakable. What they missed was why. She'd seen too many people lose everything to believe in temporary outrage. Her fight was never about winning debates. It was about rebuilding what storms, both natural and political, had destroyed. And while her speeches often went viral for their sharp logic, it was her quiet actions that changed lives. A single mother finding her house rebuilt because Jasmine refused to accept red tape as destiny. A retired teacher moved to tears as her pension case found its way to Jasmine's desk. A group of teenagers inspired to volunteer because she made kindness look like courage. She carried herself with the patience of someone who knew transformation took time, and the humility of someone who never mistook visibility for virtue. Even her critics struggled to deny her authenticity. They might have questioned her politics, but never her heart. Behind the calm exterior was a fire that refused to dim, a conviction that service didn't need an audience to matter. For Jasmine, every act of compassion was a statement louder than any speech. And every person she helped became another thread in the quiet revolution she was weaving, one built not on slogans, but on hands that healed and hope that refused to die. So when disaster struck again, this time hundreds of miles away, in a state she didn't even represent, her response wasn't calculated. It was instinct. And so, when tragedy struck once more, in a state she didn't even represent, her decision would ripple all the way to Tallahassee. The summit was meant to be routine, a bipartisan gathering to discuss relief efforts after a devastating hurricane swept across the Gulf. The nation tuned in expecting politics dressed as unity. Rows of journalists filled the hall, pens sharpened for controversy. On one side of the stage, Ron DeSantis stood flanked by state officials, expression carved from marble. On the other, Jasmine Crockett sat poised, the embodiment of calm purpose. It was their first time sharing a stage since that fiery congressional exchange months earlier, the one that had lit up cable news and cemented their rivalry in the nation's imagination. Producers whispered through headsets, already scripting the headlines. DeSantis versus Crockett, round 2. Every lens was trained, every microphone poised for sparks. When the moderator introduced them, applause split like a divided map, half polite, half protective. The tension wasn't just political, it was personal. You could feel it humming under the fluorescent lights, the air so thick even breathing sounded partisan. DeSantis adjusted his notes, eyes flicking toward Jasmine. She didn't flinch. Her gaze stayed forward, composed, her hands folded on the table as though to anchor the room. Around them, the noise of rustling papers and low murmurs swelled, waiting for someone to make the first move. Then came the small moments that no camera crew could script. A glance that lingered longer than planned, a faint nod of acknowledgement. Human gestures breaking through the scaffolding of rivalry. The audience caught it and fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to capture confrontation or connection. The moderator cleared his throat. "Governor DeSantis," he said, "you have the floor." DeSantis stepped up to the microphone, his usual confidence intact, but something in his posture had softened. The papers in his hand trembled, barely, but enough for the front row to notice. Jasmine watched, her expression unreadable. This was supposed to be the moment when the political armor returned, when talking points drowned compassion, when headlines found their bite. But instead, there was only quiet. The governor looked out across the room, then back toward her. For a second, no one moved. History itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, in one sentence, DeSantis shattered every expectation. A T first. The room couldn't tell if it was hesitation or humility that held Ron DeSantis silent. The governor gripped the edges of the podium, eyes scanning a sea of cameras that had come to witness another clash. But what came next no one was prepared for. He cleared his throat once, twice, as if pushing past the weight of years spent fighting battles that left little room for grace. "Before I begin," he said, voice steady but stripped of its usual armor, "there's something that needs to be said, something overdue." The audience shifted, uncertain. Jasmine Crockett watched him, brows drawn ever so slightly, sensing the tremor beneath the formality. DeSantis took a breath, looked down at his notes, then set them aside completely. "We talk a lot about leadership," he began, "about policy, principles, party lines. But somewhere along the way, we forgot what those words were supposed to mean." The hall quieted to a pulse. Even the camera shutters slowed. "In a time where shouting has replaced listening," he continued, his tone deepening, "where headlines have become our only measure of worth, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett reminded us that leadership still means compassion." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. This was not the man they'd come to cover. DeSantis pressed on, each sentence unfolding with the unpracticed cadence of sincerity. "I've disagreed with her, fiercely, publicly. But when disaster struck, when families in the Panhandle lost everything, it wasn't a partisan line that reached them first. It was her convoy, her volunteers. Her voice on the phone asking how she could help." Crockett blinked, caught between shock and disbelief. Her expression softened, her usual composure bending into something almost tender. DeSantis's voice lowered. "That is what public service looks like. Not a slogan, not a soundbite, but a human being who shows up when the cameras leave." Applause began hesitantly, first from the back rows, cautious, uncertain if it was permitted. Then others joined, wave by wave, until it became a standing ovation. Reporters turned to one another in stunned silence, their pre-written narratives now worthless. Crockett rose slowly, one hand to her chest, acknowledging the crowd, but keeping her gaze fixed on him. DeSantis met it, steady, unflinching, almost grateful. In that instant, the battlefield between them became a bridge. He nodded once, barely perceptible before finishing. "It takes courage to fight for what you believe in, but it takes something rarer to heal what's been broken. Congresswoman Crockett has done that. Not for applause, not for credit, but because it's who she is." The applause surged again, louder this time, rolling through the room like thunder. Some in the audience stood wiping tears they couldn't quite explain. Others simply clapped in disbelief, unsure whether they were cheering her, him, or the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, something in politics could still be real. DeSantis stepped back from the podium, hands clasped in front of him, expression calm, but eyes betraying the faintest glimmer of relief, as if finally setting down a burden he'd carried too long. Jasmine moved toward the microphone, her smile quiet, eyes bright with something between gratitude and grace. She didn't speak, just inclined her head, letting silence say what words could not. In that stillness, Two stories, so often written as enemies, briefly shared the same line of history. The journalists in the room scrambled to capture it, but some moments defy headlines. This one didn't fit the scripts they'd brought with them. It was softer, deeper, something closer to truth. And as the applause rose one final time, echoing against the marble walls, the cameras caught what history would later call the mic drop moment, a rare instant when politics gave way to humanity. But what happened after that applause would turn this moment into a viral movement. The applause had barely faded before the headlines ignited. Within minutes, clips of Ron DeSantis' tribute to Jasmine Crockett were flooding social media, cropped, captioned, and spreading like wildfire. Hashtag DeSantis Respect hit trending status on X before the governor had even left the stage. TikTok filled with split-screen edits. On one side, DeSantis' once fiery debate clips. On the other, his unexpected words of humility. The contrast hit hard. Did Ron DeSantis just praise Jasmine Crockett? One viral post read, clocking 1 million views in an hour. Cable networks scrambled to rewrite their scripts. Pundits sat stunned in split screens, their usual certainty shaken. This is unprecedented, one admitted. We've seen bipartisanship. We've seen civility. But this felt personal. Others weren't buying it. Calculati da rival analyst snapped. A PR pivot wrapped in empathy. But the internet didn't wait for verdicts. It reacted in real time. Fierce, funny, emotional. One clip showed a young voter whispering, "If this is politics now, maybe there's hope." Another stitched the moment with Crockett's hurricane footage, overlaying her steady voice. "We show up because people need us, not because cameras do." Across timelines, the tone shifted from disbelief to reflection. This is what leadership should look like. One caption read over slow-motion footage of the two exchanging that quiet, knowing nod. Even political cynics paused. News anchors admitted the energy online was different. Not outrage, but awe. For the first time in a long time, millions were sharing a political clip not out of anger, but admiration. Republicans argued over whether the governor had gone soft. Progressives debated whether to trust it. But beneath the noise, something rare was unfolding. A collective moment of stillness, a recognition that compassion, when shown by those least expected, still moved people. Comment sections filled with contradictions and confessions. "I never thought I'd say this, but I respect that. If she can forgive, maybe so can we." Imagine what could happen if more leaders acted like this. By nightfall, DeSantis' communications team was silent. Crockett's office, too. No press releases. No espin. Just a single repost from Jasmine's verified account. A clip of his words with a caption. "Grace is never weakness." The post broke 2 million likes before midnight. And as the internet argued, one quiet moment between them told a deeper story. Days later, the noise began to fade, but the moment refused to die. Clips of DeSantis' tribute were still circulating, now stripped of hashtags and filters, shared by parents to their kids, by teachers in classrooms, by strangers who hadn't watched a political video in years. Something about it lingered. Maybe it was the shock of sincerity. Maybe it was the memory of two people who were supposed to be enemies, standing on the same stage and choosing grace. When reporters finally caught up with Jasmine Crockett outside a community center in Dallas, she wasn't in front of bright lights or marble podiums. She was standing beside volunteers unloading boxes of donated food. They asked her what she thought of DeSantis' remarks. She smiled, the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and gravity, and said quietly, "Sometimes humanity finds its way through the cracks of politics." That line became the heartbeat of the story. Cable hosts replayed it on loop. Editorials called it the sound of decency rediscovered. Even late-night shows, usually eager for punchlines, let the moment breathe. For a fleeting second, the country seemed to pause to remember what respect looked like. Because it wasn't about party lines anymore. It was about the idea that acknowledgement itself, simple, uncalculated respect, could still feel revolutionary. DeSantis didn't lose anything by offering it. Crockett didn't gloat by accepting it. And the audience, weary from years of outrage, found something they didn't know they'd been missing: relief. Commentators began calling it the applause that echoed. High school students quoted it in debate clubs. Faith leaders wove it into sermons about humility and courage. And quietly, across the spectrum, people began asking the same question. If they could do that, what's stopping us? In an age of shouting matches, this one gesture felt like an exhale. It didn't erase history or heal divisions overnight, but it offered something rarer: proof that character can still interrupt chaos, and that dignity, once seen, is impossible to forget. As the credits rolled on the news cycle, one final clip resurfaced. Jasmine walking off stage that night, pausing just long enough to shake DeSantis' hand. No cameras caught what they said, but the look said everything. Because maybe, just maybe, America hasn't forgotten how to listen. In a world built on rivalry, one act of respect reminded us that compassion is the ultimate power move. Ron DeSantis' words didn't just honor Jasmine Crockett, they reignited something America had forgotten: that grace can still lead, and dignity can still define strength. Because when leaders choose empathy over ego, even the deepest divides begin to heal. If you believe dignity deserves to trend, share this moment. Subscribe and stand with the movement, proving that unity isn't naive, it's revolutionary. Because sometimes the loudest change begins in the quietest act of respect.